Hello and welcome to Cheetah Coding. Brand new year, brand new equipment. Hopefully the sound is better than my other videos. In this video, I want to talk about networking in Flutter. So networking is actually pretty easy in Flutter if you use a package called DO. So there's a few different options for networking, but DO is my favorite. DO allows you to do your normal REST calls like get, update, post, and delete. I created an image here, and I'm showing this because I want to explain the architecture of what I'll be doing in this video. This video isn't necessarily a beginner video. It assumes that you kind of understand a few things about programming in general and mobile development. So it assumes that you understand the concept of state in mobile development, and it assumes that you understand the concept of REST APIs. And we're going to focus on this middle path here. So we have our UI screen that gets data from some state. So we store our list of items in state. So a repository layer is helpful if you know that your app is going to be getting data from different places. So the three different places that we have here to get data from are the API, so a backend server, or we can get data from shared preferences, or we can get data from a local database. So those are the three that you'll see in apps the most. And in this video, we're going to focus primarily on the API client and the API interface. So just going through this middle path here. So let's get started. So let's go to the actual app here. I created a small little app that right now doesn't do much. You can just type in some text here. You can clear the text with this button here. These buttons don't do anything yet. Let's look at the code a little bit before we get started. So we have our main here, and I created a framework controller. So I'm using Git as my state management solution. You can use whatever you're comfortable with. You can use Git, you can use MobX, you can use Block, Provider, etc. So I'm using Git because that's my favorite. And I have a controller here. So we have our framework controller that holds a list of frameworks. So this app is going to be showing you a list of different coding frameworks like Flutter, React Native, etc. And we're also going to hold the currently selected framework here too. And I have this little shortcut here too that I created. So if you're not familiar with Git, but you want to learn it, I have a video on GitX that should be appearing at the top of the screen now. So we have our controller here. Let's go to the home screen. This is what you see here. We have a scaffold with the app bar container, a column with the text fields, row. I created a Cheetah button widget, which is just a custom flat button with some colors built in. So we have a splash color like so. We have a on press that we pass into here, and we have a text that we pass in for the button text. Okay, so we have our three Cheetah buttons here with the empty on press. And here we have on clear pressed, which just clears the two controllers. Okay, so I also assume that you know how to use text editing controllers. That's all we're really going to use those for here, is to clear and to actually get the text. And then we have a list view underneath here. So it's empty now, but we're going to create a list of frameworks here from our state. And the list will have framework.name, framework.language, and then we pass that into the onPressed function here that I created. Okay, then we have an icon button here with a delete icon that is empty. So you'll see that later when we actually add a framework. So yeah, this video already has a lot of UI built into it, and I did it to save some time because I wanted to focus on the actual networking part of Flutter. Okay, and if we go to our model, you can see our framework has a name, language, and object ID. So object ID is coming from our backend. And then I created a API folder here and a repository folder here, but right now those are empty. So now I will show you the actual backend that I'm using. So I'm using a service called backendless. It's very similar to Firebase, but I like it a lot better. It's a lot more professional looking in my opinion. And the actual REST console here is very handy. So you can test your actual REST calls, your get, post, put, and delete. I've already tested all this stuff before I started the video, so I'm not going to walk you through how to use backendless, but it's a very, very handy service to use. So, and it's also free to start with. Okay, so let's go back to the application. I'm going to start working on the API client first and then the API interface and then go backwards from there. The UI should be the last part that you focus on if you're building out this type of app. you always want to kind of start from the API and go backwards. So let's go back to the app, and I'm going to go to the API folder, and I'm going to create a new file, and then I'm going to call it frameworks.dart. Actually, let's call it frameworks API. Frameworks API.dart. And I'm going to go to the pubspec.yaml, and I've added a couple of different packages here. I've added Git because we're using the GitX library. I've added Dio for the Dio networking library, and I've added Logger. So Logger is a way for you to visualize your log in a more formatted way, and you'll see how that looks later on. But I recommend using the Logger package if you want your logs to look a little bit better. Okay. So before I add something here, I'm going to actually create another file. I'm going to create a client. So this will be client.dart. So this client file will actually hold the configuration for our Dio client. So I'm going to go up here, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new function and call it, so this will return Dio, and I'm going to call it client. So this will be client, and let's import this. So now I'm going to create a new instance of Dio. So Dio equals new Dio. This will be what we actually return from this function. So now we can actually configure our client. So I've opened the Dio documentation here. I recommend you reading through this. I'm going to save you a bit of trouble and just focus on the post, delete, put, and get aspect of Dio. So let's go back to the code. And the first thing I want to do is I want to put my REST API key in here. So I'm going to say string REST API key. And then I'm going to copy that from my clipboard that I have. And don't worry, by the time this video goes up, this will not be the same API key. Then I'm going to actually configure my Dio client. So to do this, you set the options on Dio. So Dio has something called options. So we can say dio.options. Then the first thing I want to set is the base URL. So that'll be the actual base URL that you use for all your requests. So base URL equals, and then I'm actually going to copy this from my clipboard too, so I don't have to type this out. So this is the format for the backend list API. Whatever your backend might be, you'll just plug that into here. I'm going to say slash here. And then for a backend list, the API key goes here. So I'm going to put that in here as a $ REST API key. And this is how my base URL will be formatted. So all of my requests to backend lists has to include this URL with this key here. So for your own app, once you put it into production, you'll probably want to put your REST API key in a more secure place. But for this video, I'm just doing this to save some time. So let's do dio.options again. Let's look at what we have here. You have query parameters, you have headers, timeouts. So you can also set your timeout. So for connect timeout, we can just put something in here like maybe 10,000. This is milliseconds. So after 10 seconds, if this doesn't connect, you will get a timeout error for your request. Then I'm going to say Dio. Then I'm going to put something called interceptors. So interceptors are ways for you to actually intercept the various communication methods of your request. So there's three parts of a request. There's the request itself, and then there's the response. So you send out a request, you get back a response. And then you might also get back an error instead with Dio. I want to be able to intercept all three of those communication points. So interceptors, and then you say dot add, and then I'm going to add a interceptors wrapper. Okay, and then for that wrapper, it takes in these three callbacks here. So on response, on request, and on error. So I'm going to add all three of these. So first, I'm going to say on request, and then this takes in a request options. So you could say request options. Let's make this full screen for now. Request options. And then I'm going to return something. Okay, let's put this on a different line. Let's put this on a different line too. Okay, and now I want to actually add these other two in here. So let's say on response, this takes in a response object. So on response, then we say response, then response. And be careful when you're actually using the response object because we're getting an error here now. It says that this class exists in both the do library and the get library. So with get, there exists a response object in there too. So I put in the wrong one here. So let's remove this. Now the error is gone. And then I want to just return a empty object for now. Okay, and let's put in the on error and repeat the same process. This takes in something called a do error. So we have do error. Let's just say error. And then I want to just put a empty block here. Okay. So now I want to create 3 functions here for these down here. And first let's return do. So return do. And now I want to create a request interceptor. Takes in the request options. And for this, I'm just going to return the options. Okay, and now I could put this up here and pass in the options. Okay, now I want to create 2 more of these. So I'm going to copy and paste these. Response interceptor and the error interceptor. You can name these whatever you want to, but I think these names are pretty descriptive. And this takes in a response object. So copy this. And let's call this response. And this takes in a do error. So let's put this here and do error. And we'll return error and return response. So these receptors are entirely optional, but I like to use these to actually debug my networking in my app. So I want to log some data, and I'm going to use the logger class for that. So I'm going to go up here to actually above my client. Let's put it up above here, and I'm going to create a new logger object. So logger for my logger package, logger equals logger. And if you look inside of this class here, there's a lot of different functions that you can call. It's very similar to the Android way of logging things. You could say logger.v for verbose, logger.d for debug, info, warning, error, etc. Okay, so we have our logger object here. Logger.d, and let's just log the options. Then copy this down here. Let's log the response. But instead of just logging the response object itself, I'm going to log the actual data. So if you look in the response object here, you can see that there's a few different fields here. There's headers, request, status, message, status code. But the thing that we want to focus on for sure is the data. So the data is the actual data from your API response. So let's just log that. Let's log response dot data. And for the error, let's log a few different things here. Let's log the error. So the do error has a few different things in it. So if you look in the do error class, you have request, response, and error. Okay, so let's go back up here. We can log the error that's inside of this error. So the actual do error object has the error inside. So it'll be error.error, which is a bit confusing, but sorry about that. And then we can do error.message. And then I think that's all we would want to do for now. Yeah, let's just do that. So I'm just doing this for debugging purposes. So that's all we need to do for our client. This is kind of how I like to set it up. There's other things that you can add to your options. Like if you have some headers, you can go up here and you can say do dot options, and you can say dot headers. And your headers are a map of type string dynamic. So headers, and then maybe you have some header, like the popular one is authorization. So if I can spell that, authorization. And then maybe you want to pass in some auth key or something. Maybe that depends on your API itself, but the API that I'm using doesn't require any headers. So I'm gonna comment that out and save. So that's our client for now. And now I want to go to the actual API. So let's go down here and I want to say future. So we're going to return a future of type response. And this will be called, let's just call it a fetch all. Pass in do, then I'm going to return do dot, and then we can actually do our request here. So dot get, and then we pass in the path to that. So it'll use our base URL plus this path. So for backend lists, if I take you back to the console again, real quick, the backend for get is just data/frameworks because that's our table name. So I'm gonna put /data/frameworks. Okay, and that's all we need to do for this. So I'm gonna pass in our DO client to this function with our base URL set up already. Then we're gonna get all of our frameworks and return that future response to whoever wants to know about the frameworks. Okay, and while I'm here, I wanna create the rest of these functions. So let's go down here. These are all gonna be future response. So I'm just gonna copy and paste this a few different times. So for this one, I wanna fetch a single framework. So I'm just gonna call this one fetch. We're gonna pass in do do.get again, but this time I want to specify the object ID. We can pass it in as extra data, or we could pass it in as a parameter query. So for me, I like to pass it in as a parameter query. / and then just pass in some object, but we're gonna pass it in here to the fetch function. And it's gonna be a string, and it'll be object ID. And then I'm just gonna pass that in here. And that's it. So for backend lists, to get a single framework, you do data/framework/object ID. So your code for this might look very different depending on the backend that you're using. And if you're creating your very own API, you can design your path however you want to for your data. Okay, so let's go down here. And now I want to do one for adding a framework. So let's do add. And for this, I want to add the object. So for backend lists again, all I would do is pass in the actual data. So let's go back to the console. So for the request body, for this, I would pass in something like name, test name, and do language, test language. And that's all that I required for my backend here, is the name and the language. So the language and the name are the only fields that I created myself. Okay, back to the application. Let's go add a framework. So for adding a framework, it has to be a map of string dynamic. So map string dynamic. So for your app, this will probably always be true. It'll probably always be a map string dynamic that you pass to your backend. And then I'm gonna call it data. And to actually add data, first we should probably change this get to a post. So post means that you're posting new data, okay? So if we look inside the post function here, you can see we have the path, which we have added already. The data is actually the data that you want to post to the backend. Then you have your query parameters. So instead of adding the query parameter directly, like so, I could have added that as a map with this field here. But we are going to use the data field to actually send our data to the backend. So I'm going to say comma, data is the field name, and then we're going to pass in that data object. And that's it. Pretty simple. So that's all you need to do to actually add data to the backend for my particular backend. And now let's go down here and let's do delete. So for delete in the backend list framework, you need to pass the object ID for that object to the backend. So we pass in our client here, and then we also pass in a string object ID. Okay. And then similar to what I did up here, I'm just going to append that to the path like so. And then I'm going to change this get to delete. Make sure you don't forget to change these around if you're copying and pasting things. So let's go down here and let's finish our API file with this last function, which will update our existing frameworks. So let's say update. So this one, we want to pass in 2 extra parameters now. We need to tell the backend which object to update based on the ID, and we need to pass in the new data. So I'm going to say string object ID, and then also pass in the map string dynamic data. Okay, and then down here we change this to put. So if you're new to REST APIs, post is used to post new data. Put is used to update data. So now I want to add in the data. And then I also want to add in the object ID. Okay. Save, and that's it. And now you can see how clean and how simple this looks with Dio. If you structure your apps in a very clean and modular way, then it's very easy for other people to actually read and comprehend what your app is doing. Okay. Very important. So we have our frameworks API and our client done. So all of the API stuff is done here. So now let's work on the repository. I'm going to go to the repository folder and create a new file, framework, repository. Okay, so the API layer was used to actually get the data from the API, right? And the only responsibility of the repository layer is to decide where the data should be coming from, okay? So that's a very important part of the architecture of this app. I want to know if I should be getting the data from the API or shared preferences or a database. Okay. But this app is pretty simple because I'm only getting it from one source. So let's start with our repository. Let's say class, let's call it framework repository. Okay. And I'm going to create a constructor here. So let's do framework repository. And the first thing I want to do is I want to initiate a new API client. So I'm gonna go up here and say deal API client. And then when we actually create this repository, I'm going to initialize that here. So API client equals client. Okay, and this client is coming from the API client file. So if you have other sources, you might want to put those here too. So you can say like initialize other sources here if needed. So you can initialize your shared preference or your database or whatever here. So we could say or database or shared preference. Let's go down here and I want to create a function to fetch all frameworks. So I want to return a list of frameworks to the actual state controller. I want to say list framework. Okay, and then I'm just going to call this fetch all frameworks. And this will be asynchronous because the fetch all in the API client is a feature. So let's do async. And first we're going to await the fetch all frameworks call. And then we're going to pass in the client. So API client. And I should call this something else so it doesn't confuse the two. So let's go back to the API file here. And this should be called something. This is not the right name. This should be fetch all. Okay, there we go. And now this returns the future response because we have future response here. So let's assign this to a response. So we have response. This is from Dart. Response equals this. So we await this and we get back our response. And then now I want to actually return a list of frameworks. So I want to return a list of frameworks. But how do we actually get that list of frameworks? From here, we have our response. And if you look inside of our response again, we have our data here. So this is our data. So our data is a list of objects, but we don't know what type of object that is yet. So that's important. So if we do response dot data, what is this data? We could assume that it's really anything because it's dynamic here, right? But based on our API structure, we know that it's a list of objects. So we know that we're getting back this list here, right? But we don't know what these are. We don't know what these objects are. So we need a way to actually map the list of data that we get back from our API to our framework class. So let's go back to the model, and down here, I'm going to create a couple of different functions. The first one is going to be a constructor. So it's going to be a named constructor. So here's our default constructor. And now I'm going to create a named one. So I'm going to say framework. So a named constructor is just a way to create multiple constructors inside of your class. So I'm going to call this from JSON. So this will be used to map our JSON object to a framework object. So we're going to pass in the map string dynamic JSON. So this map string dynamic represents these objects here. So we don't know what type of object this is, but we always know that it's a map with a string key. Okay, so we pass in that JSON object here, and then I'm going to map those values to the framework fields here. Okay, so I'm going to say name equals JSON, and then we get the name key. So name, and then I'm going to say language equals JSON language. Then I'm going to say object ID equals JSON object ID. So I'm storing the object ID because that will be important when we're going to actually update an object and delete an object. And now I'm going to create a second function. So this one will actually take our framework object and change it to a JSON map. So a map of string dynamic. So it's doing the exact opposite of what this constructor is doing. Okay, so this will return a map string dynamic. So map string dynamic, and then I'm going to call this to JSON. And then this will return a object. So it'll just return name. We could pass in the name here, the local name here, and then do language and pass in the language. Okay, and semicolon. Save. So that's all we need to do. Let's put a comment here. So this constructor takes some JSON object from the backend that we get and maps it to a framework so we can use it in our app locally. And this function here takes our existing framework and changes it to a map string dynamic so we can pass it to our API, which goes to our backend. Okay? Hope that makes sense. You'll see this pattern a lot. This is a very basic way of doing it. There's other libraries that let you get away with not actually using these names directly. So there's different libraries that you can use for annotation and so forth. But I wanted to show you the very basic way of going back and forth between your JSON object and your model. Okay, so we have that done. So back to our repository. Let's get rid of this. So now I want to change our frameworks from the backend to a list of frameworks. So we have our response here. So I want to return list of frameworks. So there's a function that you can do on the list here itself, dot from. You can see here, this creates a list of the elements. So this here, we're going to map each of the objects to a framework model that we have in our app. Okay, so I'm going to say response.data. So this is our list of JSON objects. And for each of these objects, I want to say dot map. And for each of these objects inside of here, I want to return that as a framework. So JSON. It's a little bit confusing if you haven't done this before. And then I want to return framework dot from JSON. Starting from the inside out, I take each of the JSON objects that we have inside of our response and I change it to a framework object, which is mapped from the data. It's a shortcut way of saying for each of the objects in your response data, map the fields inside to the framework using our from JSON here, and then return that as a list. Okay, so we have a list of frameworks from a list of maps. If you have any questions about that, let me know. It's a little bit confusing at first, I know. And we're getting this error here because you cannot use, or you have to use futures if you're using await async. So we're going to change this to a future like so. So all of our other functions are going to follow this similar pattern here. Okay. So let's go down here and now we're going to add the future list framework. So this function I might not actually use in the app, but it's good to know how to create it anyways. So framework, and then I'm going to say fetch framework. And then I'm going to pass in the string ID to this one because to fetch a single framework, you need the object ID. Object ID. This will be async. Change. Oops, sorry, my VS Code just crashed and I'm not sure why. Okay, back to the code. So we have fetch framework. We pass in our object ID. So I need to copy this again. So let's copy this. And instead of fetch all, we're just going to have fetch. And for fetch, we pass in both the client and the ID. So object ID. Okay, and we also do something very similar to the fetch all. So let's go up here. And I'm going to just paste that directly. And that's all we need to do for that. Okay, let's put these on a different line here. And now let's go to the third one, and that'll be the add. So I'm just going to copy and paste this first line. And we'll call this one add framework. And for the add framework, I want to pass in the entire framework. So let's pass in the new framework that we create. So let's say framework. And this function will be a bit different. So we'll still get our response. So let's do copy paste here. Instead of fetch, we'll do add. So we pass in the client to add, we pass in the framework. So we pass in framework, but if you recall in our add, it's a map string dynamic. So we have to pass in the JSON for that. So we have our framework.toJSON function. So .toJSON. So we map that framework to a JSON object so we can pass it to our API. And now here we can just return framework dot from JSON. So we get back our response here. So for the backendless API, when you add a new framework, the response that you get back is that object. Okay. So I'm not doing any error checking here. If you get back an error, then you might want to do like a try catch here. Maybe your internet is not connected, for example. But for this, we just say framework.from JSON, and then the JSON will be coming from the response. So we say response.data. And we don't return a list here, we just return a single framework. Okay? That's a lot easier than fetching from the API. So I'm going to copy and paste this down here actually. And then I'm going to do delete framework. So let's do delete. So for delete framework, remember that we want to know the object ID only. So we could pass in a string object ID. And then I'm going to say delete here. And for delete, actually, let's just put that all on the same line. So let's get rid of this. And I'm going to say await, delete. Then for delete, we pass in the client and the ID. So API client, and we pass in the object ID. Okay, and we need to change this to just response. So response. Okay. That one is pretty easy. Okay, so let's go down here and let's go for the last one. We actually don't want to return anything. So I'm just going to say update framework. Then we need to pass in the ID and the new framework. So I'm going to say string object ID and pass in the framework, and I'm going to return await. We don't actually need to return anything, but we can. So let's actually just put that here. Yeah, let's return just because. Return await update. So for update, we pass in the client, the ID, and the framework .2JSON. And this should be async. Okay. Async. Okay, so that's it for our repository. So we have 3 layers of the app done. We have the repository, we have the client done, and the API interface. So we have fetch all frameworks, fetch framework, add a framework, delete framework, and update framework. So looking at the diagram again, we have the last 3 done here. So let's work on the state now, which is our getX controller. So let's go to the framework controller. And now I'm going to add a repository to our controller. So now we have framework, repository, and let's create our constructor. So framework, repository. So now let's create a function to get all frameworks. So fetch all frameworks. This will be async. And so we have our frameworks here, right? So for getX, we say framework. So let's do frameworks equals await, and then we can say repository dot, call it fetch all frameworks. And that's it. So once we fetch all of our frameworks, we put it into our list here, and then we can say update. So remember, once again, I'm using getX, but this can easily be a change notifier in your app. And this could be the notify listeners or whatever it's called. I haven't used provider in a while. So for now, I'm just going to keep this one here. Let's test only this one function for now. So let's save. And let's go back to the main. I need to finish a bit of setup here too. So I've added the controller. Let's add the controller to our state in main. Okay, so let's do final framework controller equals framework controller dot 2 should be dot 2. I'm doing this because I only want to retrieve all of the frameworks one time when the app first loads. So I'm going to override init state and put in controller dot fetch all frameworks. So you can put this wherever your app needs it to be. You can put it in the home screen if you want to, but I'm putting it here so it only loads all the frameworks one time. Okay, and now let's go back to the controller, and I want to finish adding the rest of these functions here. I'm just going to copy and paste this, and instead of fetch all, I'm going to say fetch framework and call repository dot fetch framework. And we need to pass in the ID. So I'm going to pass the ID to this function. So let's say string ID, just pass in the ID, and let's copy this again, paste. And now let's do add framework. So add framework, and we pass in our framework here. So let's pass in the framework. Let's do add framework. And then we can just pass that in. Oh, for the fetch framework, this is probably not what you actually want to do for your app, because this list here represents all the frameworks on the server. So let's get rid of this as it is now, and let's actually just return a framework. And let's return this await, so it'll actually be a feature. Return and feature. Get rid of this. So even though this function is part of our controller, it's not actually changing the state. And this should be a list because this is a list of frameworks. So list. Okay, but yeah, again, we're not going to use this for this app, but I want to show you kind of how you would actually do this. If you wanted to actually fetch a single framework, you might not actually even want to put it inside of your controller. You might want to do a feature builder, for example, for just a single framework. So let's get rid of this for now. Okay, so back to the add framework. We don't want to set this equal to anything like so. We want to add the framework from the API to this existing list here. Okay, so let's get rid of this. And instead of await here, let's get rid of this too. I want to say frameworks.add, and then we can add the await value back. So we can say await repository dot add framework, and then we pass in the framework here. Once this await is done, we add it to the frameworks, and then we update the UI. Okay, so I hope you can see how this is different than fetching the frameworks. We are getting back a single framework from this feature. Okay, so now let's look at the delete framework. I'm going to copy and paste this line here. So for delete framework, we want to pass in the ID and the framework now because we need both. But we actually don't need to pass in both because the framework has the ID inside of it. So let's just pass in the framework. So for the delete method, we return a feature response here. So that's kind of important to note. Let's go back to the repository. The controller. And now I want to assign the value to a response object now. So response. And this is coming from the DO package. So response equals await repository dot delete framework. So actually, instead of the framework here, let's just pass in the ID. So let's pass in the string object ID. Okay, so we'll pass that into here later. So object ID response. And you can see that we have this error again that says response exists in both the DO package and the get package. So this is a good tip to get around this error. If you ever want to use get and DO in the same app, you might get this error. I want to keep the DO here, but for get, instead of importing the entire get library here, we can actually import specific parts of get instead. So let's get rid of this get import. But for getX controller, if you hover over the light bulb here, you can import it from different places. So we don't want to get it from the entire get library. We can get it from the state manager, like so. Okay. And now we have one more area here for this get. Look at the light bulb here. So instead of get here, this get comes from, I think it's the instance manager here. And you can see that our error is gone here for this because now it knows that this response is only coming from the DO library. So that's a little trick to kind of get around any errors of using a class that exists in two different libraries. So the code that I'm going to write now is very specific to backendless. I can't tell you that this will work for your app because it probably won't unless you're using backendless. But I'm just going to write it and then I'll explain it. So I'm going to say if response dot data. So that's the data that we have gotten before. Then I'm going to get a certain field from that. I'm going to say code. So code equals null. So I'm checking to see if that's null. So if this is null, then I know that the object was deleted successfully. So that if block is very specific to backendless, but the rest of this can be used in any app. Okay, so now to actually delete the data locally, I want to say frameworks dot remove where. So remove where this condition is true, where the object ID in the list that I have now equals the object ID that I pass into this function, object ID. Okay, so, and then I want to do a update. Okay, so once again, this if condition applies only to backendless, but this can apply to your app as well, assuming that you have some field some ID field in your app. So once we delete the object with this ID on the server, then based on the response that we get back, if that value or if that object was deleted, then I want to remove the object in the list in the UI where the objects are the same. Okay, so let's save this. And now I want to create one more function for the update. So let's copy and paste this. Now let's do update framework. So now I need to pass in the new data. So let's do framework. And I'm doing it this way because this framework data won't have any ID associated with it. So we're telling the API to use this new framework to update this ID here. So let's change this to update framework and pass in the framework here. And this condition will be the same based on the backendless service. So now I want to change this condition here. I need to know the index that I want to update. Once we get back the response, I need to know which item in our list to update. So I need the index. So I'm going to say int index equals frameworks. So that's our state list. Dot index where. So I want the index where. So similar to up here. Let's just copy and paste this actually. So update the ID in our list that has the same ID as the ID that we pass into this function. Okay, and give me that index. So after we have that index, I want to take that framework. So I'm going to say frameworks at that index equals this new framework that we get back from the API response. So framework dot from JSON to turn it into a framework response dot data. Okay, hope that makes sense. I can't guarantee that your backend will return the same response. Maybe it'll just return like a Boolean that says true or false if it was updated, but backendless returns the actual object itself. So that's why we use it here to turn it back into a framework and then add that to the index that we care about here. Okay, so let's save that. Remember up here, we have a selected framework field here. So I want to actually set this and clear this framework with a function in our controller. I want to create two functions. One will be called set selected, and I want to pass in the framework. Pass in framework, and we'll pass in the selected framework. We'll set it equal to that framework. And then we'll just call update. Pretty simple. Okay, and now I want to create a new function called clear selected, where we just clear that field. So I just want to say selected framework equals null. And then we say update. Easy. Okay, so now this entire controller is done. Back to the diagram again. All that's left to do is to finish our UI and actually run the code. So let's go back to our home screen now. So now I actually want to just run this just to make sure that we don't have any errors. Okay, so everything looks good. Our add and update buttons don't do anything yet, which is what we expect. Our clear works correctly. Let's look at the log. So let's see if we get an error here. We get an error right here. Framework is not some type of dynamic. Fetch all frameworks. Repository 19. Okay, let's look back at this. Repository 19. Okay, so I figured out the error. I forgot to finish the client interceptors here. So this is actually a good thing to keep in mind. Make sure that you actually put something inside of your receptors if you're going to define those here. Because if you keep these blank, then your response will just be ignored. So same with your error here. So let me add these other two response receptors here. It's a very silly mistake, but it's very easy to make. So So we pass in the response here, and then I'm going to pass in the error receptor here and pass in the error, and then let's reload. Okay, and now you see that we have the logger output here, which formats the response in a very nice JSON manner here. So you can see we have iOS, Swift, Flutter, Dart, Angular, JavaScript, Unity, C#. That's just a test one that I created a while back. Android, Kotlin, React Native, JavaScript. Okay, so that works fine now. That's what we expect to have. So let's go back to our UI now. So let's go to the home screen. So the first thing I want to do is actually show our list of frameworks in the list here. So let's go down to our list. And you can see we have controller.frameworks, index name, etc. But we're not actually showing the list. So let's change that. And let's surround our expanded here with a Git builder. So we're going to hook in our UI to our controller state. So if you're not familiar with GitX, look at my video that I did on GitX. It talks about all the stuff in there. So instead of expanded, we're going to first have Git builder, and then that builder will take in a controller, and then we'll return that expanded. Okay, and the Git builder would be of type framework controller. So we can put the type here too, framework controller. And let's put parentheses around this. Okay. And then we need an extra parentheses down here. Save. So now this controller should be updated when we retrieve our items, and we'll get that from our frameworks state and show the name and the language. Okay, so let's save and reload. And now you can see we have our list of frameworks here. So we have iOS, Flutter, Angular, Unity, Test, Android, and React Native. So the trash icon doesn't do anything yet either. Okay, and when we click on something, it doesn't do anything either. Let's actually create the code to add a new framework to the list. So we have the add Cheetah button here. I want to create a new function called onAddPressed. So I'm going to say onAddPressed, and I'm going to go up here and I'm going to create that function. So let's go up here and let's do onAddPressed. And since we have access to our text editing controllers, I'm not going to pass in our data to this function. I'm just going to create the framework here from those controllers. So I'm going to say framework equals new framework, and then just create the name from the name controller. So name controller dot text to get the text from the controller, language, then language controller dot text. Okay, so this represents our new framework that we want to add to the list. So down here, I also want to clear these text here. So we have the onClear pressed for our button here. This function already does that, so I'm just going to call that again. So let's call onClear pressed. And now I'm going to add that framework to the controller. So I'm going to say controller dot add framework, and then just add that framework, and that's it. And we don't actually need to do anything else, because once that framework is added, the update will get called for the controller, which will actually rebuild our list. And that new item should be in our list because of our Git builder here. Okay, so let's save. And it'll appear at the bottom of the list. I'm going to delete some of these items in the backend. So let me bring this back. And I'm going to delete the test. Let's delete Unity, Kotlin, Flutter, Dart. Okay, so we'll delete those. Let's go back to the app, and I'm going to reload. And now we have our 3 frameworks here. So you could also put like a spinner here too, like a a progress bar here to let you know that the API is waiting for the data, but that's fine. Okay, so we have our 3 items here. Now I'm going to add Flutter and let's say Dart. So now I'll press add. You see a request here. This is our response. So our response is name. I added an extra thing here too. That's fine. Name and language. And now we can see Flutter and Dart here. Okay, so we added that here. You can check the backend and you can see that Flutter and Dart has been added here too. Okay. So this looks pretty good so far. Okay, so now let's work on the delete. I think that's an easy one too. So let's go down here to the icon and I'll create a new function called onDeletePressed. Okay, and for this one, I need to know the ID of the framework. We have access to it because we know the index. So we can say controller dot frameworks index dot object ID. So we have onDeletePressed. So let's create this function up here. onDeletePressed, pass in the string ID, and then first I want to say onClearPressed, and I want to call the controller dot delete framework and pass in the ID. Simple. That's it. So when we delete a framework, the UI should be updated. Okay. So let's save, restart, wait for the data. Let's delete the iOS Swift. So let's delete. And now it's gone. And backend list just returns the deletion time if it was successful. Okay, so let's go back to the browser here and you can see that the iOS Swift is gone now. Okay, so we have the add done, we have the update done. Or sorry, we have the add done, we have the delete done. The final thing to work on it would be the update. So for this, I want to change the UI a little bit too. The user needs to be aware of whether they are adding a new item or updating a existing item. So I want to disable the add button if they want to update an existing framework, and I want to disable the update button if they want to add a new framework. Okay, and I want to wrap our Cheetah buttons in a Git builder now. And I'm doing that because I want to know if we have a selected framework or not. You'll see how this fits together in a bit. Actually, let's just copy and paste this to save time. And we'll do this like such. Same with this. And let's paste this in here and like so. Okay. Disabling a button in Flutter just involves setting the onPressed to null. That's it. And the button will be disabled. So if we don't have a currently selected framework, I want to disable the update button and keep the add button enabled. So I'm going to create a ternary operation and the onPressed. I'm going to say if controller dot selected framework is equal to null, have that as the onPressed, else pass in null. Okay, and that's it. So similar to that, I want to have that here too. So now if the selected framework is null, then I want the inverse of what I just did above. So if we don't have a selected framework, then the update button should be null. Else we pass in a function that we still need to create. The clear button is fine, actually. We can probably get rid of that controller for the clear button. Let's get rid of that here. Okay, so we're not actually setting this yet. So let's actually figure out how to set this. So when we press an item on the list, I want to set the selected framework to that item. Okay, so you can see here, one item pressed. We're passing that framework here. The first thing I want to do is I want to show the name and the language in these text views here, or in these text fields here. So let's say name controller dot text equals framework dot name. Language controller dot text equals language equals framework dot language. Okay, and last, I want to set that selected field in our controller. So we can say controller dot set selected to that framework. And that's it. And I want to set this text field here too to the ID, just so we know that we have a currently selected one, because the user could be typing in a new one and it wouldn't be obvious if that's an existing one or if it's a brand new one. So let's go down here to the selected item goes here, and I'm going to wrap that in a Git builder like before. So Git builder, wrap that. And I'm going to say if the controller dot selected framework equals null, then we'll just put an empty string here. Or I want to put the selected framework object ID. So controller dot selected framework dot object ID. Okay, so if we are currently selecting a framework, then I want that object ID to be shown up here, just so we are sure that we are trying to update an existing object. So let's save, and I want to check to see that I have finished these functions. We have not changed this yet. We'll come back to this after we test it. And remember, in the clear, we need to actually clear that selected. So let's actually do that first. So let's do controller dot clear selected. So that clears that selected framework, which should clear the text at the top too. So let's save, reload. So you can see that our update button is disabled by default, which is what we expect. Clear clears it. Let's put something in here. Clear works fine. Let's try to update the Angular. So let's press Angular. And you can see that we have Angular and JavaScript here with our object ID here. Okay, so now let's press clear. And now we are in the add mode. So this mode lets you add a new framework. Okay, so I just wanted to kind of create two different modes for the user so they can add and update a framework on the same screen. Okay, so now let's actually finish our update function. Let's call it on update pressed. And for this, we pass in the string ID, same as before. And this one, I want to create the same framework object that we did up here. So I'm going to copy this, paste here, call onClear pressed, and then I call the update function in the getX controller. So let's do controller dot update framework, pass the ID and the framework, and that's it. So let's save, reload. Oh yeah, I forgot to actually put that on the onPress. Okay, so let's go down here, put that here, and now we could pass in the selected framework ID. So we could say controller dot selected framework dot object ID. So I think that covers the 4 REST operations that we need. So let's save this and reload. Try to create a test one. So let's say test something. Let's add. So we've added that here. We can look in the REST console. There it is. If you want more information, we can get that here. So we see the data here. And now let's try to update this one. So let's update the test, update it. Let's press this, update it. We get back our updated object. And you can see that the UI has been updated. So the actual object ID has not changed, but our data has changed. You can go back to the REST console. Let's do a git. And you can see our test with the updated language. And now let's try to clear this, which puts us in the add mode. So now we can add a new framework. So let's say Unity and C#, add, and we get that here. Now let's try to delete our test, update it, and that's gone. And our data in our console should be correct. There you go. Okay, this was a very long video. Congrats if you watched the entire thing, but this is a very important video. This video shows you how to use a very popular networking tool in Flutter called Dio and use it with your state management solution. So this is a very, very close step to creating a full app that you can upload to the Play Store. Yeah, I recommend using backend a lot for creating backends. So yeah, I'm pretty tired now. This was a lot to go over. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. I'll be doing more specific videos with networking in the future. Yeah, stay tuned for the next video and happy coding. Bye.